The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you all. Wind Cave National Park is located in the Black Hills of South Dakota, and it's actually in the limestone strata that completely surrounds the Black Hills. And in this limestone strata, there are about 200 known caves, and some speculate that all of the caves surrounding the Black Hills are actually linked in one massive system. I have been to Wind Cave 3 times in my life. The first time was when I was a seminary intern in a church in Nebraska, and we took our youth group up to the Black Hills for a week, ostensibly to see the Passion Play at the very end of it. But we did all sorts of touristy things in the meantime. Wind Cave was one of them. And the tour lasted about an hour, and we went into the cave down through an elevator and walked on well-paved, marked paths that were well lit. They had guardrails, and when we had to go up and down, there were staircases. But the scenery in each room was incredible. It was just awesome. A couple years later, Thelma and I took a vacation, just the two of us, in the Black Hills, and I wanted to show her Wind Cave. And so we went back and got tickets and went on the tour. And I was anticipating that we would see exactly the same rooms, that we would go on the same tour through the cave. But it turned out it was a completely different tour. Yes, it was well paved. It still had guardrails. It still had stairs. It still was well lit. But we saw different rooms and different wonders and came away, again, awestruck. The third time we went into Wind Cave was about 4 years ago. And we took the Candlelight Tour. They only take about 10 people a day on this tour. You get a bucket with a candle in it. And you go down the same elevator and out the same door. And then you come to a gate on the pathway, which you go through. And beyond the gate is all darkness. And for about 4 hours, the 10 of us, plus the guiding ranger, scrambled through the cave with nothing but our 11 candles to light our path. There was no pavement, there were no stairs. We had to clamber up and down ledges, through cracks. And the cave was even more awesome than I remembered on the well-traveled guided tours. I think the Gospel of John is very much like this. There are a number of well-traveled interpretive paths through John that many people follow and are meaningful for them. But the reality of the Gospel of John is far more vast than the well-traveled interpretations that we get from the church handed down from generation to generation. John is far more extensive. It is far more multi-layered. It is far more complex than the simple interpretations that we get. And I think our text for this morning kind of illustrates the various layers and levels at which we can approach the Gospel of John. So, for example, we may read the Gospel of John, and normally when this particular text arises in the lectionary, it is paired with Psalm 23. And so we hear these two texts together. And we begin to fuse them in our minds, thinking, well, Jesus says he's the good shepherd. And we read in Psalm 23 about God as a great shepherd who is protective and provides things for us. And so we think, well, this text is about Jesus conveying to us that Jesus is divine protector, divine provider, and yet somehow more accessible because of his humanity to us. And that gives some people a great deal of comfort. That's one interpretive path. There's another interpretive path. If you read the Gospel of John more deeply, you will see that Jesus engages in constant conflict with the religious leaders of the Jews in both Judea and in Galilee. And if you are also a deep reader of other aspects of the Bible, you will notice that the immediate pre-exilic prophets and the prophets of the early exile often use the metaphor of shepherd for the ordained leaders of the people of Israel, and they are vociferous in their condemnation of how these metaphorical shepherds, the leaders of Israel, fleeced the people for their own ends and lined their own pockets and were not authentic, good, caring servant leaders. And so we juxtapose that with what's going on in the Gospel of John with Jesus and the religious leaders and say, oh, well, those bad shepherds of ancient Israel are kind of, the leaders that are of the Jews in the Gospel of John are kind of following that paradigm, and Jesus stands over and against them as a different kind of a leader, one who is not self-serving, one who lays down his life for us. And if you follow that interpretive path, well and good, that is certainly valid. But there is more. And I would like to invite you on a brief candlelight tour of the Gospel of John. And in doing so, the first thing we have to notice is that this text that comes out of chapter 10 does not stand on its own. It is the concluding discourse of a whole number of chapters, beginning at chapter 7, that is set in Jerusalem during the feast of Sukkot. Sukkot often gets translated into English as the Feast of Tabernacles or the Feast of Booths, and in ancient Canaan, before the people of Israel arrived. Sukkot was a fall festival where people built temporary shelters or hovels or shacks in the fields so that they could hurry up and get the harvest in quickly over a 1-week period. So they wouldn't waste time going back to their homes to sleep or eat. They lived there in the fields in these temporary shelters. As the gods of Canaan were more or less dismissed in the religion of the region, and the worship of the God of Israel began to take ascendancy, religious overtones began being put on this harvest festival. And they likened living in the booths or in the shacks or in the hovels in the fields to being sort of analogous to the journey that their ancestors took in the Exodus, journeying in tents in the wilderness for 40 years. And so it became a festival of celebrating the journey home from the land of Egypt. Fast forward to the Second Temple and the time of Jesus, and we're now on this side of the exile. And not only in the time of Jesus is the Exodus remembered and commemorated in this festival, but the homecoming from exile as well. And so that also is overlaid with the sense of the people coming from Babylon, from Mesopotamia, in caravan, living in tents until they arrive at Jerusalem. And so the whole festival is to celebrate the finding of home, coming into the land of promise and living in safety and security. And in the ancient sort of celebration of this festival, there are 3 main liturgical movements. The first movement happens on the first day of the 7-day festival, which is a reading of Torah. The reading of the law, or the Torah can be translated, the teachings. And this follows from the practice of Ezra and Nehemiah when they came home from exile and began to reestablish Jerusalem, rebuild the temple. One of the first things they did was to read Torah to the people and engage in a new covenant ceremony with God. And lo and behold, what do we find Jesus? In the temple. And he is disputing Torah. The question at issue is Jesus healing on the Sabbath day. And there's an intricate argument going back and forth between Jesus and the leaders of the Jews about which commandment overrides the other when 2 conflict. And like I say, it's a very intricate argument. We don't hear very much of the side that was not Jesus. We hear mostly about what Jesus is saying. But clearly what John is trying to say is that Jesus is not only the authoritative interpreter of Torah. There is no I am statement in this section. But I think what John is trying to say is Jesus is living Torah. I am Torah. After 7 days go by, there's another major liturgical action that happens outside of the temple, and it's between the temple complex itself and the pool of Siloam. And in the morning, people formed a literal bucket brigade and lifted water out of the pool of Siloam and formed what became sort of an artificial river of living water going up to the temple and washing the altar, making it clean. And as that is happening in the Gospel of John, we get this little paragraph of Jesus standing by, watching it, and saying, "Come to me, all who thirst. From the heart of the faithful flow streams of living water." And again, there's no I am statement here. Jesus has already said that in chapter 4, I am the living water, to the woman at the well in Samaria. But again, you get that sense that Jesus is setting himself up over and against what's going on in the festival and reinterpreting it. And then the final act of Sukkot happens that evening on the last day, when the temple and its altar is finally cleansed. And in the evening, they lit the great lamps in the temple and around the temple. And for those of you who came to the Bible study on Wednesday night with Jane, and she showed sort of a model of what the temple might have looked like in Herod's time, you saw that it was all whitewashed and burnished with gold leaf at the top, sort of a dazzling sight during the day. Imagine in a time when there's no electricity. And that is the only place where great fires and lanterns are lit in the city of Jerusalem, how the temple must have seemed like a beacon, a shining beacon on the hill at night, symbolizing home. And it's here that Jesus says, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness. And so we see as John progresses through Sukkot, and describes the major liturgical movements of it, he places Jesus at the center of each one and basically tries to convey that all of the intent of Sukkot, all of what the liturgy of Sukkot is about, Jesus is and more. And if we don't get that through the complex reading of the discourses, there is this wonderful chapter 9 where there's the story of the healing of the man who was born blind. And it sort of reads like a funny thing happened on the way to the forum. It's really a very funny story and very un-John-like, which is mostly serious dialogue through the rest of the gospel. But if you look at the healing itself, it summarizes everything that John has described Jesus in Sukkot. It begins with a disputation about Torah. The disciples are arguing with Jesus. Who sinned that this man was born blind? And they go back and forth amongst themselves until Jesus says, stop. No one sinned. Again, Jesus is authoritative on the interpretation of Torah. Jesus tells the man to do what? To go to the pool of Siloam, where the living water to wash the temple has its source, and to cleanse himself. And as he goes to cleanse in the pool of Siloam, the mud on his eyes is cleared away, and he is given sight for the first time and perceives light. And so in the healing, you've got Torah, you've got living water, you've got light. All those things that summarize Sukkot. And if that's not all, the story then begins to take this wonderful turn about what happens next. Because as the authorities find out that the man born blind is now healed and can see, they're infuriated. They want to know how this happens. And so they question him. And all the guy can tell him is what he experienced. Of course, he didn't see Jesus, so he can't point Jesus out. And in the end, they excommunicate him. They cast him out of blessed community. And then they go find his parents. And his parents say, what are you asking us for? What do we know? He's of age. Go ask him. And effectively, they disown him too. And towards the end of this story, this man who was born blind, who can now see, is sort of wandering around Jerusalem like a lost little lamb until he hears the voice of Jesus. and he recognizes in the voice the person who healed him. And there's this wonderful dialogue in which they encounter each other and get to know each other. And the man who is now excommunicated and homeless pledges his life to Jesus as Jesus, becoming his own head of household, literally joins the family of Jesus and finds home again, which is what the whole festival of Sukkot is about. And then we sort of move on to this wonderful dialogue where Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. I am the gate for the sheep. Only there's something about that that is somewhat dissonant. I mean, how does that really follow through and create a hold-on for the rest of this series of dialogues and this movement through Sukkot from chapter 7 all the way through 10? I mean, chapter 10, as we have read, can stand all by itself, but it is intentionally linked. There is more to the story. In the 16th century, and I know that's 1600 years later, a liturgy was published in a Jewish community for the celebration of Sukkot in the synagogue. And obviously it's different from what we have in the Gospel of John, because in the Gospel of John, Sukkot was one of the pilgrimage festivals centered around the temple. The temple no longer exists. But one of the interesting features of this liturgy is that the 7 great shepherds of Israel each come, followed by all the rest of them, one of them speaking each evening to the congregation in the synagogue. And as you read the liturgy, you know, it's very obviously late medieval Renaissance Jewish rabbinic theology, and obviously way beyond what happened in the first century. But as you look at who the shepherds are, it's intriguing. It's Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, followed by Aaron and Moses, then Joseph, out of order, and David. And if you look at that progression of what these 7 great shepherds of Israel mean to the history of Israel and to Judaism, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had the promise of home. Moses and Aaron journeyed with the people to find that home. Joseph provided a home for the people of Israel in a time of famine when they could not live where they were living before. And David finally establishes the homeland, the kingdom of Israel. And it begs the question, how long have these shepherds been associated with the festival of Sukkot? I think we have the answer in the Gospel of John, when Jesus talks about himself as the Good Shepherd. I think they always were associated, and what we're seeing is John summing up the great festival, saying, no, Jesus is not the Good Shepherd, in contradistinction to the present leaders of the Jews and the religious authorities. No, Jesus is the noble shepherd, which is the better translation, in contradistinction to the great shepherds of Israel. And if you think those 7 shepherds were great, Jesus is even greater. It is in Jesus that we find our true homecoming. That's the transformation that the Gospel of John wants us to realize at this level of the Candlelight Tour. That we read this text and we come away with a different awareness and a deeper perception about who Jesus is and what Jesus means to us. And so what does that mean for us as we live in these times? I am very mindful that this is the 3rd Sunday in Lent. Last year, the 3rd Sunday in Lent was the last time we worshiped in our sanctuary. Now, in the calendar, that's next week. But liturgically, that's this week. And so for a liturgical year, we have been kind of living spiritually in our own sort of temporary booths and our own temporary tabernacles, worshiping online, trying as best as we can to keep connection with each other and keep faith with each other. journeying almost as nomads. And I think as we have gone through this year, we have sort of piqued our yearning for home, which is what the festival of Sukkot is supposed to address. And I think what the Gospel of John is trying to tell us is, it's not necessarily our place or our temple or our sanctuary that is our home. It is Jesus, and in the fellowship of Jesus that we find our home. And I pray that when we go back into our home, and I pray that it is soon, we may not go back and just sort of relish in the space, but relish that the community of Jesus to which we belong is at last in a place where it can continue to thrive and grow. And when we begin to invite people to come to our church, it's not necessarily to come to our building and to come to our programs and to come to our community, so to speak, what is ours, but to come into the blessed community and the embracing community of the fellowship of Jesus. And I think if we go back into our facilities with that understanding of who we are as God's people, that home is in the presence of Jesus, that our safety and our security and our future is in the hands of Jesus, we will go back into our facilities stronger as a community, more missional, more welcoming, and more able to live out the gospel in ways I think John wishes us to see it. And if that's the case, may it be so.